Thank you for joining us. I am Amy Buskey. I'm the branch manager at the New Richmond Branch Library. And today we are going to be talking with Greg Roberts, who is a trustee of Clermont County Historical Society, as well as Historic New Richmond, and also the director for the state of Ohio for the Ohio River National Freedom Corridor. We're going to be discussing today Clermont County's history with the Underground Railroad.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's my pleasure to be here. And I've been studying the Underground Railroad for some time, particularly here in Clermont County. And I have to give credit to a few mentors of mine. Most people from Claremont County knew and loved Rick Crawford. He was a wonderful friend of mine and miss him dearly. And just a great resource. You know, I often think that myself, my head is full of worthless facts that I come up particularly. Rick could recall things that, again, that was just incredible. And so I miss him dearly. Another mentor I'd like to mention, again, for friends of the Richmond Library, particularly the Richmond branch, Eileen Witt.
Yes.
I've known Eileen since basically I was in high school, and she was just again a treasure, a great researcher. Back in the days before the internet, when you dug information up the old-fashioned way, and Eileen again, and she's still with us. God bless her, and great treasure. And a lot of the things that I'll be presenting this evening, I'll credit a good friend and researcher, Mr. Gary Knepp. Gary's book, Freedom Struggle, I highly recommend it if you really want to get down to the details, some of which I'll talk a little bit about, but I highly recommend you pick up Gary's book there at your local branch. I think Gary would appreciate it. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and we'll start the presentation. What I'm going to talk about, what I'm going to show here is a derivation of a slideshow, a PowerPoint presentation that I've done several times for the Lead Claremont group led by Bob Pautke currently. And so we do a history tour. A lot of people, and I think particularly us who grew up in Claremont County, do not fully appreciate the rich history and the importance, the significance of the people and the movements, many of which have their roots in Claremont County. Again, back to my good friend Rick Crawford, he was very adamant about this sort of thing. And the other thing that I learned from Rick is that we here in Claremont County all too often let somebody else tell our story. We let people in Cincinnati again interpret, and typically the county's not put in historically not in such a good light. And so I hope that what I share here with this presentation will enlighten some folks. Maybe you'll learn something that you didn't know. But again, this is a place that we all should be proud of, especially when it came to the era in which the Underground Railroad operated, because we have a very, very rich Underground Railroad history, and also people who were at the forefront of the abolition movement. And also, again, we have a kind of a key person I'll talk about a little bit that had a little bit of hand in ending slavery in this country, who's not given a whole lot of credit for it. So I'll go ahead and we'll go ahead to the next slide. This is a statement that I picked up, I don't know where, but gal Sonia Johnson. I have no idea who Sonia Johnson is, but we must remember that one determined person can make a significant difference, and that a small group of determined people can change the course of history. And this is what the small group of people who were involved in the Underground Railroad did. They changed the course of history. And again, Underground Railroad, first multiracial civil rights movement on the planet. And it was men, women, blacks, white, all helping enslaved individuals reach freedom. Not all Canada. Again, the experts will tell you that there were some freedom seekers reach freedom in Mexico and other places, but it's an interesting field of study, and we learn more and more because a lot of these stories are untold, and a lot of our stories here in Claremont County, unfortunately, are untold, and there's still a lot to learn about the history of the operatives on the Underground Railroad here in Claremont County. And so I want to give credit to our Convention and Visitors Bureau for publishing the Claremont Freedom Trail. It's a wonderful brochure, and I reference that here in this presentation. And I call attention to the fact that currently Claremont County has 20 sites that are recognized by by the National Park Service Network to Freedom program. And again, for many years, we had 19, which were the most in the entire of any county in the entire country. And again, a lot of the credit goes to Gary Knapp. The most recent addition I'll talk about is Sumerian Cemetery here in New Richmond. I had a hand in getting that listing, and so I recently spoke with Gary, and I said, Gary, the score is now Gary Knapp 19, Greg Roberts 1. And I'll probably not catch up with him, but again, these are not the only sites in Clermont County that are worthy of recognition as Underground Railroad sites. But again, it's very meticulous. You have to have documented evidence that there was a connection with the Underground Railroad or an individual who was, again, an operative, a conductor or whatnot on the Underground Railroad. So pick up the brochure. It's online and on the Convention Visitors Bureau's website. I think it's Discover Claremont. And so, check it out. Now, here's a textbook image of the Underground Railroad routes. And if you'll notice, the main route comes right up from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, right through this little section between Ripley and Cincinnati. And guess where that is? Good old Claremont. And so we just don't make this stuff up. It's documented. It's real, and it's significant. We'll start out, and again, I'm going to apologize from the get-go because the tour that we did was very much southern biased as far as the southern part of the county. And so being a New Richmond guy, again, pardon me, I'm going to highlight and start off with the New Richmond sites. And so we'll start with this gentleman by the name of James Gillespie Birney. Birney was from Danville, Kentucky. He was the son of a slaveholder. He studied law, went off to Huntsville, Alabama to make fame and fortune, got in trouble with gambling and drinking and all kinds of stuff. And again, he had inherited slaves from his father. To pay off his debts, he sold his slaves. Again, wasn't because he had seen the light and turned to be an abolitionist, but he had an epiphany at one point and decided that he was going to devote his life to end the institution of slavery. And the tool that he decided to use was the pen through an abolitionist newspaper, and also he was an attorney. And so it was also use logic and reason against the institution of slavery. Not so much a religious, again, most people know that a lot of people for religious reasons were strongly opposed to slavery, but in this case, Mr. Birney used logic, reason, the Constitution, and the pen and freedom of speech through his newspaper, The Philanthropist, which he published initially here in New Richmond. He was threatened with his life when he tried to start it in Danville, Kentucky. Plan B was to go to Cincinnati. He met the same threats. We'll kill you if you do that. And here in New Richmond, he was offered protection and some financial incentive by some local abolitionists. And I'll talk a little bit about that here on the next slide. But he published here for about 6 months. He thought the coast was clear in Cincinnati, but you'll see in the bottom image, I believe in July of 1836 or thereabouts, he moved to Cincinnati, and a pro-slavery mob ransacked his offices, destroyed his press, and threw the typeset into the Ohio River. And there were several Black people that were murdered in this mob violence on the west side of Cincinnati. And again, this was particularly the mob violence in Cincinnati turned a lot of hearts and minds in Cincinnati toward the anti-slavery cause. And what they saw was if the pro-slavery cause would stoop to mob violence to protect that institution, it was abhorrent. And again, this may remind people of things that are happening in this country here recently in terms of people resorting to violence to promote their cause. And again, it had a similar effect, I think, as it has had some people here today back in 1836, as far as saying, this is wrong. If people are going to go to these type of extremes for their cause, we don't want any part of it. And so the people that were on the fence, like I said before, their hearts and minds began to change, at least here in the southwest Ohio and the Cincinnati area. Now, I mentioned that there were individuals who hosted Birney, and these are two of them. Dr. John Rogers, who is better known as the doctor who, again, attended the birth of Ulysses S Grant, 5 miles upriver in Point Pleasant from the Richmond. And that's a picture of old Doc Rogers in front of the birthplace there, taken shortly after the baby he delivered had just been promoted to General of all the Armies by President Abraham Lincoln, and was about to deliver the final blow to end slavery in this country, something that Dr. Rogers, as an abolitionist, had devoted his life to accomplish. And so he was quite a proud guy there when he did the little selfie or photo op there in front of the birthplace in 1864. Thomas Donaldson was a Welshman who lived on a farm between New Richmond and Clermontville. He married the daughter of James Parker there, who ran the Parker Academy. After his marriage to Susanna Parker, he started being active on the Underground Railroad. And he was a fairly wealthy individual, successful individual, as was Dr. Rogers. And they're the ones who not only offered money and protection for Bernie here in New Richmond, they formed a group that was later called the Chieftains of Liberty. And they would stand guard over the press here on the corner of Walnut and Willow Street, because there were real threats by pro-slavery folks to come and do harm to Bernie and, of course, his press, which they did later in Cincinnati, as we saw in the previous slide. Also here in New Richmond, we have what was originally the first Presbyterian church, which is celebrating this year its bicentennial. The Presbyterian Church, now known as Cranston Presbyterian Church, was renowned for its radical anti-slavery stance and rebelling against the Cincinnati Presbytery and demanding that the Cincinnati Presbytery not commune with any churches or denominations that condoned slavery, and threatened to leave that presbytery if the church did not do so. And so we had many what were considered radical preachers. In the left-hand corner, as a gentleman by the name of Reverend Amos Dresser. He was one of the Lane Seminary rebels from Cincinnati's Lane Seminary. That the gal in the center there, Harriet Beecher Stowe, her father Lyman Beecher ran the seminary, and there was a debate over the issue of slavery there, and several of the students left the school because Beecher tried to get the students not to debate slavery because it was too volatile. And again, Beecher was counting on Cincinnati money and to support his institution there, and he didn't want to cut off potential donors by causing a stir. But his daughter wound up causing quite a stir with a little book she wrote called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Abraham Lincoln allegedly said to her that, so you're the little lady that started this great big war. And so the strong connection there. Now, top right-hand corner there is Harriet's husband, Stowe, and he had preached at the Presbyterian Church. Harriet's brother, George Beecher, was a standing minister at the Richmond Presbyterian Church and also simultaneously at the Batavia Presbyterian Church. That he shared the pulpit both places. Bottom left-hand corner is Reverend John Rankin. Rankin is best known for his Underground Railroad activity in Ripley, and he was the Presbyterian minister there in Ripley. But after the Civil War, he moved to New Richmond and became the standing minister at our Presbyterian Church in New Richmond. Interestingly, his wife, her maiden name was Jean Lowry. And Jean's father, his first name escapes me right now, but Reverend Lowry was the first minister at New Richmond First Presbyterian Church in 1821. So there was a family connection to New Richmond. And so he finished out his career as a minister here at our Presbyterian Church in New Richmond. Now, over in the right-hand corner there is Reverend John Gregg Fee. Now, Fee was from Bracken County, Kentucky, near Augusta. Now, Fee, his father, owned slaves. Now, I happen to be familiar with the Kentucky history of the Fee family, and the Fees in Kentucky known as slaveholders. And Reverend Fee came to Lane Seminary. He attended Miami University and became an abolitionist and went to Dad and said, you know, you're going to go to hell if you don't free these slaves. And his father basically told him where to go and disowned him and disinherited him. And so he went on to found Berea College in Kentucky, the first college in the South that was co-ed and biracial. He got the idea, and I'll tell you a little bit, from an institution here in Claremont County. That was prior to Berea in 1839. But anyway, when John Brown led a raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in October of 1858, John Gregg Fee was in New York raising money for Berea College. Word got out in Kentucky of a quotation that Fee allegedly said he wished there were 100 John Browns. And so that the fake news of the day was John Gregg Fee was going to come back and arm the slaves. and so he had a greeting party. And before he even got home, they ran his family and his supporters in Berea, out of Berea, under force of arms. They came north. John Gregg Fee hooked up with his family in Augusta. They went to Maysville. Again, always under the threat of death and physical violence. He was advised by a justice of the peace in Maysville, you ought to get across the river. And he did. He came across the river to Clermont County and enrolled his family in the Parker Academy. And he stayed on the Ohio side throughout the Civil War and helped recruit African-American soldiers and tended to their refugee families at Camp Nelson, Kentucky. But again, these all have connections here to Claremont County. Now, we have 2 sites here that are on the Network to Freedom. Of those, actually, we have 3 now, of those 20 sites. One is the Richmond Waterfront, which is unique. It's the only site in the network of a whole area. And again, Terry Knapp was mainly responsible for that. The Bernie site, where the Philanthropist newspaper was published, is also on the Network to Freedom. Now, the Waterfront was the site of 2 documented slave escapes. One was a Jim and Joe story, and many folks may be familiar with the Box Brown story, where an enslaved individual was shipped in a wooden container, a box, from Baltimore to Philadelphia. In our case, Joe, an enslaved individual from Louisville, Kentucky, a free African-American friend of his, Jim, shipped him in a wooden crate from Louisville, Kentucky to New Richmond.
Oh, wow.
And where he was taken out of the box and taken to Cincinnati, where the so-called president of the Underground Railroad, Levi Coffin, bought him a train ticket from Cincinnati to Sandusky, Ohio. And so here's a case where actually a railroad was used, but it wasn't underground. It was a regular train to help, again, an enslaved individual reach freedom in Canada. Leroy Lee, this happened late in the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, but slaves in Kentucky were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Only those in states that had rebelled and seceded from the Union, and only after Union troops had occupied those territories were the slaves freed. And so Leroy Lee had run off from his farm, where he was owned by the Anderson family right across the river in Carthage, Kentucky. Slave catchers in Cincinnati brought him to the riverfront here in New Richmond and paraded him down the street. Folks here in New Richmond, many of whom had lost family members in the war, fighting for folks like Leroy Lee's freedom, said, "This ain't happening here, folks." And so they outnumbered and outgunned the slave catchers, and they were forced to free Leroy Lee. Leroy Lee went on to serve in the Union Army and later was one of the first police sergeants in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so we here in New Richmond have signage now to denote many of our Underground Railroad abolitionist sites. And we have a walking tour that we encourage anyone to stop at any one of our places like the Front Street Cafe and others, pick up a brochure and do a self-guided walking tour. And again, back to the Claremont County Freedom Tour, parts of that can be a walking tour and driving tour of many of the fine villages with Underground Railroad history here in Claremont County. Now, the third site that was just listed in November of 2020 with the Network to Freedom was our Sumerian Cemetery. It's an traditional African-American cemetery, of which we have 3: Citizens, Sumerian, and there's a Moreland Cemetery on 12 Mile Road that are all African-American cemeteries. Sumerian Cemetery warranted being on the Network to Freedom list because a woman by the name of Louisa Piquette, who operated a safe house in downtown Cincinnati on 3rd Street, again, within stone's throw of the Freedom Center. Of course, they don't acknowledge Louisa Piquette at the Freedom Center. But again, like I said, within a stone's throw of the Freedom Center was a safe house operated by Louisa Piquette, who after the Civil War, she and her husband moved to New Richmond, where they lived out the remaining days of their lives, and she's buried in our Sumerian Cemetery here in Claremont County. Again, along with 24 African-American Civil War soldiers.
Wow.
Yeah. And next slide here is just up the road, and I say downtown Clermontville. This is the Claremont Academy. This, what you see in the image, is the Academy building, which was constructed around 1839. To the left, the frame building was the dormitory for male students. And the Academy opened in 1839, and it was open to blacks, whites, men, women. Northern Kentucky University has in their possession the original ledger book. And so there's documented evidence that on day one, the school opened in 1839. There were African Americans, whites, men, and women enrolled. We know they were taught in the same classroom because there was only one classroom. And so other institutions like Oberlin College, yes, they had the policy of coeducation and integration, but scholars are not so sure if they actually practice that policy before the Claremont Academy here in Clermont County. And Northern Kentucky University has a wonderful website. They've got a whole group of students over the past 5 years or so that have been researching various archives from descendants of the Parkers who founded the Academy in 1839 and doing wonderful research. And they discovered a connection. One of the students was the wife of the famous landscape artist Duncanson, who just recently got acknowledged by one of his paintings by the Bidens in the White House. So yeah, Robert Sheldon Duncanson, his wife Phoebe attended the Claremont Academy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
He also did all the murals at the Taft House,
Yes,
or Taft Museum.
Yeah, the wonderful murals at the Taft Museum, which they discovered under wallpaper a few years back, were done by Duncanson. And the Parkers were familiar with Duncanson because James Parker, the first principal of the Parker Claremont Academy, was also the first principal when they had an academic regimen at Wilberforce University of Pennsylvania. And they were familiar with Duncanson there because he was doing sketches. And there's documentation where the Parker children watched him work on some of the sketches for some of the paintings that he did subsequent to that time. Now, again, this was in a time where most people didn't think it was, women didn't need an education. They should be doing housework. But the Academy had these three prominent ladies that attended there. Eliza Connor was from Monroe Township. She became very active in the women's rights movement and was right up there with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and spoke side by side with them at some of the significant women's rights conventions in the late 1800s. She was a journalist. She was known to write very prolifically, over 2,000 words a day. Back to the students at Northern Kentucky University, one of their students had found articles that she wrote for the Saturday Evening Post that the Saturday Evening Post archivists didn't even know existed, and didn't even know that they were written by a woman, because she used a pen name called Zig for the articles she wrote that were published in the Saturday Evening Post. And so, yeah, again, we have a lot of people in Claremont County that I call almost famous, and she was pretty. Eliza Connor was pretty well known. She married a steamboat captain from the Richmond, and again, quite incredible. Livy Bear was a poet from Bethel, as was Abby McKeever. Both, and Abby McKeever, I've come across at least half a dozen hymns that were published in popular hymnals where Abby had written the words to these hymns. And again, I'm not very musical, but I do have a cousin who's quite an accomplished pianist, and she's played a few of them for me, and they're actually quite good. Now, we're going to talk about this guy. And not only do I consider Ulysses S. Grant America's first civil rights president, and that is indeed a fact, I also, since we're talking about Underground Railroad and abolitionism, I call Ulysses S. Grant the ultimate abolitionist. Because, again, people have said, and including the guy pictured down in the bottom right, Mr. Douglas, that Abraham Lincoln, he with his pen wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Ulysses S Grant with his sword made emancipation fact. And again, he held Grant in much higher esteem than he did Lincoln, because he says Grant was always on the side of his people, of the enslaved. Lincoln was a politician, was a little wishy-washy on the subject, at least at the beginning. And so he said Grant was always on the right as far as he was concerned. And again, a lot of people, a lot of scholars, and I still see stuff today that disparage Grant's record as president. Oh, it was a corrupt mess. Well, that again, in my concern, they had fake news back in those days as well. And again, let's, scholars now like Ron Chernow and others are going back and looking at the actual record and telling a different story about Grant. Again, not only did he win the war, which ended slavery in his country, when he ran for president for the first time in 1868, big part of his platform was ratification of the 15th Amendment, which is the Voting Rights Amendment, which we still debate and talk about today. 1871, he signed, at his urging, what was called the Force Act, or the Ku Klux Klan Act. In those days, Nathan Bedford Forrest, former Confederate general, had formed the Ku Klux Klan, and they were, again, terrorists. They were terrorizing the newly enfranchised Black people to keep them from voting. Grant sent federal troops under authorization of this act to stop that. And during his administration, he destroyed the original Klan. It went out of existence and didn't come back until the late 19th, early 20th century. And they're still prancing around this country today, I'm ashamed to say. So Grant, again, given very little credit for what he did as president and what he tried to do. Unfortunately, the country didn't follow Grant. We reverted back, and Jim Crow came about after Grant left office, and again, he was labeled as a drunk, a bad president, and not very bright. Of course, he supported African American rights, and so again, the racism in this country was such that you had to be crazy or stupid to do that. And so it's a shame how this country treated his legacy. And again, if I have anything to do with it and have anything to say about it, we are going to start here in Claremont County next year, changing that as much as we can. And again, here's the way Grant was revered at the time of his death. What you're looking at on the right is his funeral procession. His funeral procession took place in New York City. Over 1.5 million people lined the streets of New York to see the funeral procession. 100,000 men in uniform marched in the funeral procession. Both former Union and Confederate generals were his pallbearers. The procession was 9 miles long. And so this kind of gives you an idea of how respected, how revered this man was during his lifetime. And it's unimaginable how, again, his star fell based on so-called lost cause historians and raising up Robert E. Lee as the great general of the Civil War. When, again, there's only one great general, as far as I'm concerned, in the Civil War. His name is Ulysses S Grant. He was born here in Clermont County, Ohio. Again, we're going to be celebrating his 200th birthday in next year, 2022. What you see here, a couple images on the left-hand side there, is it has a label, maybe difficult to see. It says our 3 great presidents: Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Ulysses S. Grant. George Washington, the father; Abraham Lincoln, the martyr; Grant, the savior of the United States of America. On the right-hand side is the Grant's 100th commemoration. President Warren G. Harding spoke from the speaker's stand there in the middle, and an estimated crowd of 30,000 people were in the little hamlet of Point Pleasant. And so if you've ever been there, it'd be kind of hard to get 30,000 people there, but that's what they say, how many folks were there. Now, I bring up this image, which again, I take offense to, and it's probably not going to happen, but it needs to be corrected. They need to have the right faces at Mount Rushmore. But unfortunately, that's one of many things that this country hasn't gotten right yet, but we're a work in progress. Now let's move on upriver to Utopia. And now we're going to take a different little diversion here. Utopia, here in good old conservative Clermont County, was a site of 3 experimental socialist or communist communities. Starting with the followers of the gentleman on the left, Charles Fourier, who is a French philosopher. He was really ahead of his time. He was an early believer in climate change. He was also an early believer in evolution. But his thought was a little on the strange side. As far as climate change, he thought the oceans at some time would turn to lemonade.
Oh,
yeah. The other thing, as far as evolution, he thought he felt that human beings would eventually evolve and grow a prehensile tail. Now that would come in handy sometimes, particularly. but again, a group of followers established a community there and was now known Utopia. They were socialists. They lived in equally sized apartments. They built along the Ohio River, and given the fact that everyone shared equally, no matter how hard they worked, and the benefits of the group, people became a little jealous of the fact that, hey, I'm busting my butt, and old Joe over here is just kind of lounging around, and he gets the same benefits I do. Again, the fundamental problem with socialism. That group failed. Later, a group of spiritualists. These are folks that believed that they could communicate with the dead. And part of that group was a gentleman in the center at top, that was Thomas Wattles. His brother is to his left on the right-hand side of the screen. His name was Augustus Wattles. They were both acquainted with the gentleman at the bottom. His name is John Brown, a fellow I mentioned earlier who led the raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to try to start a slave insurrection and was summarily hung for treason. And Southerners say that was the beginning of the Civil War and what they call, what used to call the War of Northern Aggression. And so both the Wattles brothers were devout abolitionists. They were devoted toward creating educational opportunities for African Americans, and they were part of that experimental community there in Utopia. That it also broke up, and another communal group, the Oneida movement, like New Harmony, Indiana, they were the last group to try to make a go of it in Utopia. And again, all 3 of these groups, they failed. Right here, again, communists here in good old Clermont County. So again, many people probably heard, and Rick Crawford used to give tours of an interesting site. It's allegedly an underground church where the spiritualists, again, allegedly had their communications with the dearly departed. And so I've, again, had the pleasure and the honor of knowing the folks that own that property, and they've allowed me to take tours there, which I have on these tours, and it's a weird place. That's all I can say. And I'll just show you how weird. Here's a slide of a group. This is a group of a church group from Moscow, and I've had an old digital camera that I took thousands and thousands of pictures with, and this is the only place where I've taken photographs, and weird things like a little blob that the arrow is pointing to showed up, and I'm told that those are orbs, and I don't know, and there's all kinds of theories, both supernatural and otherwise, that explain the orbs. But again, freaky. I took a gentleman, was on one of my tours a few years ago, and I was talking about the orbs pictures before we got to the site, and I was asked to stop talking about it. I was freaking him out. He took some pictures himself, and the day after the tour, he was home. He sent me an email and he said, Greg, I was really freaked out when you were talking about that stuff. I just looked at the pictures that I took. Now I am really freaked out. And he sent me a copy, and his photograph had these little orbs all over the picture. And it was,
Oh, wow.
it looked like, the bubbles in the Lawrence Welk show, So yeah, some bizarre things there. And again, different theories of the Underground Church. Don't think there's any evidence that it was actually used on the Underground Railroad. Could have been. Some say that may have been food storage, but you can see over here at the left-hand side, that's one of 4 fireplaces that are in this place. Typically, cellars and places used to store wine, beer, or food don't have fireplaces. And so there is, again, probably some credence that this may have actually been used as a church or something other than food storage. Again, the next stop going upriver is Bullskin Creek, which again is the beginning in Ohio of what's known as the Bullskin Trace. Up in Edenton, Ohio, there's a monument there. And again, this was a traditional route of the bison herds that were in the eastern United States, and it became the natural route north-south for the native tribes. And then the early pioneers, the Simon Kentons, Daniel Boones, would follow the Bullskin Trace. It was also used on the Underground Railroad, main route for slaves seeking freedom in Canada. So that's why if you go down to Bullskin Creek, they're past Utopia, or again, it's this side of Utopia, between Shiloh and Utopia. One of the prettiest spots in Clermont County. If you get a chance, I highly recommend you go there. Now we'll move on to Felicity, and named after the Fee family. Now, I mentioned John Gregg Fee earlier, associated with the Claremont Academy and the founding of Berea College. Well, in Kentucky, they know the Fee family as a slaveholding family, and the rebel son John tried to convince his father. Well, here on this side of the river, there are lots of Fees in our history books, and those were related to John Gregg Fee. They were cousins and whatnot, and they were abolitionists. They were anti-slavery. And so he came to Ohio amongst family and friends that shared his anti-slavery views. The Fee family is very prominent in Felicity, and were founders of Felicity and Feesburg and several other towns with the Fee name in it. And so the picture there is the Felicity Wesleyan Church, which was, again, a very active congregation and the abolition and Underground Railroad activities in the county. Now we move on to Bethel. And again, this fellow here, I always kind of cringe. This poor man, and that's the best image they could get of the fellow, old Senator Thomas Morrison. And again, what a guy he was. He's the first U.S. senator in U.S. history to call for the immediate abolition of slavery on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
Wow.
And for that reason, he was a one-term senator. He termed the coin the slaveocracy. And so the quote here is he was advocating, because citizens from Ohio were petitioning Congress and the Senate against slavery. And he was arguing, again, for the abolition of slavery. And again, like I said, very, very significant in being the first one in American history to do so. And again, date February 9th, 1839. Now, again, to clean up old Tom Morris's, again, if we ever have a movie, which he probably would deserve a movie about Thomas Morris, I'd say this guy could portray him. Might get a little more cred. Batavia, gentleman here is former Clermont County prosecutor John Jolliffe. John Jolliffe was a Quaker, and he was involved in at least 17 cases where he represented, again, pro bono, defending fugitive slaves. His most famous defendant that he represented was Margaret Garner. And many folks are probably familiar with the Margaret Garner story in Cincinnati. She tried to escape from her farm over in Boone County, Kentucky, was surrounded by slave catchers, and rather than allow her daughter to be returned to slavery, she slashed her daughter's throat, killed her. And this became, of course, a national story, again, highlighting the fact that, slavery was such an abhorrent institution that a mother would kill their own child rather than see it returned to slavery. And again, there are books and plays and movies written about this story. And again, this guy, John Jolliffe, was in the center of it, again, with that Clermont County connection.
Now, was Margaret Garner in Clermont County, or was that?
Not that we know of. Again, she was after the incident. Jolliffe tried to get her extradited, again, actually to stand trial in Cincinnati. He was going to defend her, and again, because she was sentenced to, a life sentence in slavery. What they did with a lot of enslaved people who they were concerned that were a flight risk, they sold them down south.
Right.
That's what happened to Margaret Garner.
Okay.
And they had no idea where she went, ever found her. And a lot of people don't know this, and Gary Knapp has discovered this particular story here in Claremont County. It's another sad part of our history. There's at least, I believe, 5 documented incidents where free blacks were kidnapped and sold into slavery and never returned.
Wow.
And so anybody who's familiar with the book and the story 12 Years a Slave, where a free black individual was kidnapped and sold into slavery, and by the grace of God was returned to freedom with some help of some abolitionists, including Cincinnati and Simon B. Chase, Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury, whose face I think is what on the $1,000 bill, $10,000 bill.
No idea. Haven't seen one of those.
I've never seen one, so I don't know. But anyway, the sad reality is that slave catchers, if they weren't always able to find a freedom seeker who had escaped from slavery, very often would kidnap free blacks,
right, and
sell them into slavery. So it was just a horrific time in our country's history. So Amy, since this is my last slide, and so if you have any questions, if I don't know the answer, I tell people I used to work in sales, so if I don't know the answer, I'll make it up.
I have just one more question for you, and that is, if a person could only visit 1 or 2 Underground Railroad sites here in Clermont County, where would you recommend they start?
Well, that's a good question. The easy answer is pick up one of the brochures and go see them all. Before you visit any of them, I strongly suggest that you do a little research, maybe read some of these books. You don't have to, again, you don't have to be a scholar, but familiarize yourself with the background story as much as you can. But what I would recommend is to take that brochure and visit any of the villages here in Claremont County. As I mentioned, we've got New Richmond, Moscow, Bethel, Felicity, Williamsburg, Batavia, and again, unfortunately, I apologize to my friends in Williamsburg. Williamsburg has fantastic, and I think they may have the most network to freedom sites of any town in Claremont County. And again, they have incredible Underground Railroad history and sites. But a lot of the sites that are on this Freedom Trail, are privately owned, and so be respectful of the fact that it is private property. Again, I mentioned cemeteries. They don't complain too much in the cemetery, so feel free to visit, walk around the cemeteries. But again, I haven't really answered your question, but I would be remiss if I didn't say, really got to visit the Grant birthplace. If you're from Claremont County, you never visit the Grant birthplace, shame on you. Shame on you. But the library has a great collection of books with background information on the Underground Railroad in general. And a lot of people don't appreciate this. The study of the Underground Railroad here in the United States, it's taught in universities around the world. We've been fortunate enough to go to several national Underground Railroad conferences sponsored by the National Park Service. There are scholars there that present, from universities in Europe, Asia, it's interesting and maybe even a little embarrassing that, foreign countries take more interest in this history than we Americans do. But again, of course, not folks that frequent the Clermont County Public Library system. I mean,
of course not. Here in Claremont County Public Library, we do have quite a few resources, as Greg mentioned. We've also presented a collection of those resources, and these would be available if you stop by at the branch or if you follow our page on our Facebook page, which is Claremont County Public Library. And I would like to thank Greg Roberts for his excellent presentation. And if you have any more questions, please come and visit us at the library soon.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.